Good Tuesday morning, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt, joined now by Dr. Kevin Roberts, president of the Heritage Foundation. Good morning, Dr. Roberts. How are you?
Man, I'm doing great anytime I'm with you, Hugh.
Well, thank you so much. I love Dawn's Early Light, your brand new book. I've been talking about it for 2 weeks. Heritage Foundation, which Dr. Roberts leads, is a longtime sponsor of my program, and they often lend me a radio studio when I need one. But I didn't realize you were writing this when I saw you backstage during the campaign, Kevin Roberts. When did you decide? Because I thought you were all about Project 2025 and then having to fight off what it was and what it wasn't. When did you find time to write Dawn's Early Light?
Well, a few years ago, when I was leading the Texas Public Policy Foundation, I had this idea that as the new right was, of course, needing to be fused with the old right, putting together this new conservative movement, that maybe I would have some ideas there that would be helpful. Actually, there are ideas, as you know, that you often talk about on your show. And so 3 years ago this month, when I became president of the Heritage Foundation, my new colleagues there suggested that I continue this project. We released this about 6 weeks ago. Sales have been good, but far more importantly than sales is the encouragement that I think a lot of Americans have gotten from this book, which is to say this: elections matter. Obviously, they have consequences. There's good public policy that will flow from this election victory. But the encouragement that people feel is that I argue that we are at the beginning of a golden era of American history, because Americans are ready to take back not just their politics, but also their institutions.
Kevin Robert, you might be right. I want to cover a lot of things with you that jumped out at me from Dawn's Early Light. I want to go to the most important one first. Page 231, quote, "I was not always a China hawk. Like most conservatives, I thought most U.S. policy towards China should be one of friendly competition." Right, that describes me exactly. You had preceded it with this sentence: "When I arrived at the Heritage Foundation, I laid down a marker, come hell or high water, we're going to lead the movement against China," and I'm proud to say that we have. So, Dr. Roberts, we have all traveled the same road, the Nixon road. We thought it was going to be great. When Bill Clinton said, "come on in" to the OECD or whatever it was he was invited into in 1992, he joined, and then China broke all the rules and we're screwed. Do you think the country gets it now?
I do. 2.5 years ago, when I went to my Heritage colleagues and I said, look, I was wrong on this issue, and so I want to tell all of you who also were wrong that it doesn't mean you're bad people. In fact, we had this wonderful conversation inside Heritage featuring our longtime president and founder, Dr. Ed Fulner, who said exactly the same thing. The point is, at that point, Hugh, I didn't think that the movement in the country would come along with us so quickly. It has, and probably the greatest measure of success thus far is that there is an emerging, very strong bipartisan consensus in Congress against the Chinese Communist Party. That's the kind of vocabulary, really the only kind of vocabulary, that the leaders of the CCP understand. And I'm gratified that my colleagues at Heritage, but also friends across the movement, yourself included, and many people across the political spectrum in the United States recognize the threat that China poses. If, in fact, this trajectory continues of developing this bipartisan consensus against China, then I'm optimistic that we're going to defeat them in every way imaginable.
If we know who the enemy is, we are very good at dealing with it, and we do. They are an enemy. They are not merely an adversary. They're not a near-peer competitor. They are an enemy, and they are deadly serious in their ambitions. Dr. Roberts, I want to compliment you. I don't know how easy or difficult it was to write candidly about your upbringing in Louisiana, about your father having a drinking problem, about your mother, and about your brother, but I thought it added real punch to the book. Do you want to tell people about why you bring a lot of skin to the game when it comes especially to your brother and America's education system?
Look, it was difficult. Most of us are private people, and I wanted this book to be about other Americans and about the American future and not about me, so that my purposes were well understood. But my colleagues and friends, and particularly my wonderful Chief of Staff, Wes Coopersmith, encouraged me to tell my brother's story. My brother, when he was 15 and I was 9, was out drinking with friends. Of course, he shouldn't have been doing that. He, like me and my older sister, were going through the repercussions of my parents' divorce, and he wrecked my mom's car and ended up taking his own life that night, now 40 years ago. And that kind of story is something that many Americans have felt. But what it did for me is actually create this opportunity to receive the love of God. I felt the morning after my brother's death, as I write about in the book, tremendous embrace from the Holy Spirit. And two people in my life to whom I dedicate the book, my maternal grandparents, Mark and Betty Petrie, I say are my heroes because they are people who cultivated my faith in me. They cultivated also my faith in America. This happened to be at the same time that Ronald Reagan was president. And as I was sitting down to write the book and talking about policy and intellectual things, these ideas that you talk about so eloquently on your show, I realized that my understanding of conservatism, my understanding of America, my understanding of faith, period, of self-governance in this world really was formed in what was the lowest point in my life. And I hope that by telling that story, many Americans take encouragement, regardless of whatever trials and tribulations they have undergone, they are undergoing, that the American dream is still alive. Because if I, in fact, could grow up and live the American dream, which I do every day, then it really is possible for anyone.
You know, the reason I want to tell the story, Kevin, is that, of course, it's drive time on the East Coast right now, and we're talking to people getting ready to go to work. But on the West Coast, it's the middle of the night, and people might listen to this on tape delay, or they might listen to the podcast. But I want those who are in the middle of the night awake because they are being gnawed at by economic anxiety or fear about the future or any particular kind of set of problems, that it's a wonderful country in which to get better and get up off the ground in. I'm curious. At the same time I've been reading Dawn's Early Light, I've been reading this book, Kevin Roberts, A Land of Hope by Wilfred McClay, Hillsdale historian, because I got to teach my law students American history, it turns out, because history and originalism are back. Did you have part of that in mind when you set out, when you wrote about school and education and that we need to teach piety? Did you realize we just don't have a common understanding of America anymore because of the way schools have shattered?
I did. You know, I've spent a generation worried about that. About a generation ago, I began my career as an early American history professor at a major university in the Southwest. And although I enjoyed most of the time my interaction with my colleagues, they became a little too politicized thereafter. The greatest worry I had as I was sitting in faculty meetings with them was that this group of very smart people, and let's just ascribe to them the best of intentions, had very different views of what it was to be an American, what America was, period. And as I looked at their book selections, particularly looking at the terrible, terrible book, Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, I realized just in this one little corner of the universe that thousands of students were going to learn the wrong thing about America. And so as I made the switch professionally from higher education to public policy, I made as one of my major objectives that I was going to, wherever I was, play a role in helping to fix this problem of how we teach American history. McClay's book, I think, is one of the best, if not the best, modern examples of how we can do that in a way that doesn't whitewash the difficult chapters, but in fact provides a very good context, a very good perspective of how it is that a country that is so imperfect, and of course it is because it's a human enterprise, could overcome that and have in the mechanics and the details of its founding the very basis by which we would overcome those imperfections. That is the story of America that ought to be told in every classroom.
And it's necessary for every student to learn. And the reason I'm teaching it to law students is because with the Supreme Court majority focused on history and original meaning of the public words, they've got to know the story if they're going to understand the Constitution. Kevin Roberts, I always like to list most surprising thing I find in a book. My most surprising thing comes on page 131. And I want you to know I began my television career in 1992 in February. So in April of 1992, I'm doing the nightly news Monday through Friday in L.A. when the riots break out. So I find on page 131 the rooftop Koreans. I didn't think anyone outside of L.A. knew anything about the rooftop Koreans. How did you know about the rooftop Koreans? You weren't that old. I mean, not many people who aren't Angelenos at the time, or maybe even in the media at the time, know about the rooftop Koreans.
Yeah, I was a high school senior, a bit of a nerd, and followed current events. I remembered them, somewhere in the recesses of my memory. But look, when you're a historian and you sit down to write a book, even though this is hopefully written not with such an academic tone, these things come back to you. And I had not thought about the rooftop Koreans in decades, Hugh. It's, of course, no surprise to me that you were there and probably the world's expert on them.
I never interviewed him. I just remember that the image they presented on there, it was in Koreatown, L.A., and that's a actual few set of blocks in mid-Wilshire. And they were not going to be looted. They were not going to be burned. And so they took their weapons and they took to the roofs. And it's a great example of how Americans actually fight when they want to fight and they're allowed to fight. Let's talk about another thing that surprised me, Kevin. No freedom without a frontier. I've long said we won World War II because all of our soldiers came from the farm, the frontier, the factory. I'm not sure that the United States still has farm, frontier, factory genes in it. You seem pretty confident that we do. What do you mean by there's no freedom without the frontier?
Well, what I mean by that is the very point that you're making, that for most of our republic's history, one of the geniuses of our success, whether it's domestically manifested or, as you point out, in foreign policy and warfare in World War II, is that we've had this frontier. We've literally had far more rural area than we've had urban areas. One of the things that worries me, and it's not a side swipe at people who prefer living in cities, is that as we have become more urbanized very steadily over the last century, that we are losing what is a key part of our DNA, which is that having access to rural areas, or as we are now saying in this conversation, the frontier, we're losing what it means to be an American. And therefore, two things, Hugh. First of all, those of us who live in cities or in suburbs, as I tell my colleagues at Heritage, go touch some grass. Spend some time in God's first book, whether it's mountains or bayous or something in between. Go do that. It actually does allow us to ground ourselves to something that's more important than us, and that's the concrete around us. But the second thing is swerving into public policy. Even though I'm always going to be skeptical of using federal government for bad ends, I think we ought to think in public policy how we can inspire Americans to resettle some of these rural areas. I don't think that that's necessarily answered by rural broadband, although that's a good conversation. It's actually something more meaningful, which is to say we have to revitalize Main Street in the United States if we want to revitalize the American dream.
If I can keep you, Kevin, during the break, we'll add it to the YouTube interview, but I want to talk to you about the role of religion in America, because it does seem to me that absent a renewal of the latter, the former can't actually get back on its feet at full strength. Don't go anywhere, America. Kevin Roberts is going to stay with me for 5 more minutes. The book is Dawn's Early Light. You can get it at Amazon, every bookstore in America. Dawn's Early Light, Taking Back Washington to Save America. Stay tuned.